This is Elana Stein Hain. We are on our second week of talking about the concept of mושבע ועומד מהר Sinai, that a person who tries to take a shevua, who tries to make an oath, either to transgress a mitzvah or even to perform a mitzvah, that oath is null and void. It is not binding. Why is it not binding? Because a person has already a default shevua that applies to them all the way back from her Sinai. What we did in week one is independent of what we're doing in week two. In week one, we asked the question of what shevua at Har Sinai? What are we talking about? So you can go back to the shir to hear the different approaches. But in general, something that we emphasized last week is we talked about the fact that the shevua at Har Sinai, whatever that refers to, is something that the tzibur is able to impact and affect for all of its future. A tzibur being something different than a yachid or a yachida, an individual. Additionally, we talked about the fact that that shvua, according to the Tosefta in Sota, was al dat Moshe and al dat Hamakom. The Gemara phrases it that way, really, in Shevuot. So if it's al dat Hamakom and al dat Moshe, the idea is that the tzibur can never actually nullify it, even in the future. But let's move on today to the different opinions that show up subtly about mושבע ועומד מהר Sinai, because it seems open shut that a shvua to do a mitzvah or to transgress an avera would be null and void. But the truth is, if you look in Sifrut Tanait, if you look in Tanaitic literature, you find something a little more complicated than that. And I want to think with you about the big ideas that emerge from what seems to be a subtle machloket. Moreover, I want to think about some of the other messiness that comes up in the conversation about mושבע ועומד מהר Sinai, including the messiness around, well, what if you make a neder instead of a shvua? Instead of saying, I take a shvua that I'm not going to sit in a sukkah, what if I take a neder where I say, a sukkah is asura alai upon pain of a korban, something like that, where I talk about the act, the item instead of talking about myself. Does that hold? Or is that also similarly like mושבע ועומד מהר Sinai, and I can't do that either? What if I take a shvua? Here's another piece. What if I take a shvua where I say that I'm actually just doing this in order to motivate myself to do a mitzvah? Like I say, oh, I take a shvua that I'm going to sit in the sukkah, right? Like I'm just trying to motivate myself. Is that the same thing? Is that a nothing burger or is that something? And then another example that comes up, and you've definitely seen it in the Gemara in Shevuot, probably at this point, the idea of what if you take a shvua that's more kolelet? Instead of saying, I take a shvua that I won't sit in a sukkah, what if I say, I take a shvua that I'll never sit in a hut, or I won't sit in a hut this year? I'm not taking a shvua specifically on a sukkah, for a mitzvah or anti-mitzvah. I'm taking just on a hut. So it contains other aspects. So does the shvua in the end actually get effectuated because it's not only about a mitzvah? So we're going to talk about some of these things and the big ideas behind them. Let's jump right in and look at a subtle machloket tanaim about the issue of mושבע ועומד מהר Sinai. In order to do this, let's just remind ourselves of what the psukim that we are engaging are from the Torah. There's two segments, Vayikra Hey and Bamidbar Lamed. In Vayikra Hey, we saw, O nefesh ki tishava levatei v'svatayim lahara ulehitiv. If a person makes a swear, a shvua, to utter with their mouths, with their lips, to do bad or to do good, l'chol asher yivateh adam b'shvua v'ne'elam mimenu, anything that a person might say and then they forget about it, v'hu yadav Hashem la'achat me'ela, right? And later they realize that they're guilty in these things, meaning they didn't keep the shvua. That's a pasuk just about shvuot. Then you look in Bamidbar Lamed, and you have a pasuk that is both about shvuot and nidarim. Vayidaber Moshe el Rashei Hamatot livnei Yisrael limor. Moshe speaks to the heads of the shvatim, saying, Zeh hadavar asher tzivah Hashem. This is what God commanded. Ish ki yidur neder lashem. If a person makes a neder, remember the difference between a neder and a shvua. A neder is I say something about something outside of me. A shvua, I say something about myself, right? So if a person makes a neder and then it adds o hi shava shvua, or a person takes a shvua, le'asor isar al nafsho, in order to impose an obligation on themselves, Lo yachel devara, right? Their word should not be, I might say chulin, but it shouldn't be broken, meaning they have to do it. K'chol hayotze mipiv yaseh. Everything that came out of their mouth, they have to do. So these are the backgrounds for how we might start to think about when is a shvua chala, when is a shvua effectuated, when is a neder chal, when is a neder effectuated. So the machloket tanaim as promised. So the Mishnah in Shvuot in Perek Gimel, Mishnah Vav, the first line is very, very clear. Nishba levatel et mitzvah velo bitel patur. If a person made a shvua to nullify a mitzvah, meaning to violate a mitzvah, and they didn't violate it, patur. They haven't done anything wrong in terms of breaking a shvua, right? They're exempt from any punishment because that shvua doesn't matter. It's a nothing. Lekayim velokiyim patur. Likewise, if someone made a shvua to do a mitzvah, to perform a mitzvah, and they didn't perform the mitzvah, I mean, they might have a problem because they didn't perform the mitzvah, but in terms of having violated their shvua, they're exempt, right? So that seems very, very clear. Why? Because you're mushba v'omid mehar Sinai. You already have a shvua on you. Maybe we would say ein shvua chala al shvua, right? We're not going to say one shvua can come upon the other shvua. You already have a shvua that's on you. Now, I look at that opinion and I say to myself, you know what this tells me? It tells me that as much as we are able to legislate extra on ourselves through Shevuot, our words build worlds and they bind us. At the same time, the Torah has actually a stronger and prior hold upon us. I think that's very significant because if you're a Jew walking around in the world with a sense that the Torah has a prior hold on you, and I mean that in the happiest and most beautiful way possible. And then you're trying to do other things upon that. That is something separate from the Torah's hold on you. And I think that's incredibly powerful to consider. But here comes a different perspective, which is Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. Shayam Bedin, we might have thought, and even as like a logical inference, we might have thought, as like a kal v'chomer, shehe chayav, a person actually would be obligated for not following through when they take a shvua to do a mitzvah. Kidiv Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, like Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says. And it tells you now, what is that? Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says, Ma im harshut she'enu mushba aleh mi'ar Sinai, harei chayav aleh. If something that is volitional, that you don't have a prior shvua on you from Har Sinai, you would be obligated if you violated your oath to do it and then you didn't do it. Mitzvah shehu mushba aleh Har Sinai, eino din she'eh chayav aleh. Of course, if there's something that you're already required to do from Sinai, and then you added a shvua onto it and said, I'm going to be mekayem at this, if you didn't do it, of course that should be something that you're obligated in. Meaning, the worlds that you build with your mouth, of course they can't undermine Torah, but the worlds that you build with your mouth should actually be reinforced by what the Torah has to say. In fact, I might even argue that there's so much logic in saying, for the same reason that I can't take a shvua to transgress the Torah, namely because the Torah has this strong hold on me, and whatever I say should be buttressing Torah and not trying to violate it. For that same reason, I might argue and say, of course, a shvua l'kayem mitzvah should be a shvua because my words are buttressing what's already in the Torah. Now, I understand technically you might say, but a shvua isn't able to be effectuated on top of another shvua. Okay, that's a technical read, but from a philosophical perspective, I could understand how Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera's approach makes sense. Now, I want to show you, and then of course they answer Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera and say, no, 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 no. There's a total difference between making a shvua on something volitional and making a shvua on a mitzvah, because a shvua on something volitional, the Torah said that it has to be something where you're lahara or lehitiv, right? You can say yes, you can say no, you can do yes, you can do no, and you can't do that. It has to be you're only nishba'at to lekayem mitzvah, not nishba'at la'avor avera. So that's not equivalent. It doesn't work, right? But I want to show you a third approach. And this, I think, is a very subtle approach. And I don't think everybody would agree that Um, I don't think everybody would agree that this is what's going on in this Mishnah, but I will say I saw this analysis from the Safrai family in their Mishnah to Eretz Yisrael, and I thought it was pretty compelling actually to read it this way. So it goes like this: the Mishnah in Shevuot, Perek Gimel, Mishnah Dalet. It's a Mishnah before, right? A few Mishnah before what we just saw. Shevua shelo ochal. If a person makes a shevua, I will not eat. ואכל אוכלים שאינן ראויים לאכילה, ושתה משכין שאינן ראויים לשתייה. And what they did is they ate things that are not really food. And they drank things that are not really drinks. Potter, they haven't violated their shvua because they haven't really eaten anything that's considered real ochel or drank anything that's considered real mashke, right? But what about this? Shvua shelo ochal, somebody takes a shvua, I will not eat. Ve'achal nevelot utrefot, shkatzim uremasim. And what they decided to eat is they ate things that are not kosher. They ate food that Mehar Sinai, they're not allowed to eat. Have they violated their shvua or not? So Tanakama here says, Chayav. Actually, not only have they violated an avera of eating these things, they've also violated their shvua. So some people want to read this and say, see, you actually can take a shvua related to things that are connected to Har Sinai, and it's not an invalid shvua. It's a real shvua. Now, I would be intrigued to think about what that means. What that means is if you have the opinion that you can take a shvua on something that min haTorah you're not supposed to do, or you take a shvua that min haTorah you're not supposed to do, if you say that, then what you're really saying is, let's say I've made such a shvua, and let's do a harder situation, not where I said, I won't eat, and then I ate non-kosher food, God forbid. But let's say I take a shvua to say I'm going to eat non-kosher food, right? Let's say I do that. The shvua is actually chala. It's effective. But obviously I'm not allowed to eat non-kosher food. So I'm actually between Scylla and Charybdis here. I have to not violate the Torah, but I have to violate my shvua. So I'm going to get punished one way or another. And I think this sheet is really intriguing. And again, I don't know if it's the most compelling read necessarily of, what that Tanakama is really saying. For a few reasons, I'm not sure it's such a compelling read, but I think it's interesting to consider because what that would be saying is if we have something in the Torah that we're not allowed to do, and then we ourselves try to build something up against that, then legitimately speaking, what we now have is we've created a situation of conflict for ourselves. And one way or another, we are going to find ourselves in trouble. Either we're going to be giving a korban because we violated our shvua, or we're going to be punished for violating the Torah. And those really sit against each other in a really significant way. It makes you realize kind of what a gift the idea of saying that you can't take a shvua against something in the Torah is. Because the gift that it's giving you is it's saying, no, 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 keep the Torah. Don't even think twice about trying to keep your shvua. Just keep the Torah. But it's intriguing nonetheless. So that's the first thing I wanted to point out is that there are those who really try to see that there may be multiple ways to read. And there's a Tosefta that some people think is a little bit more compelling on this score. Maybe another example later in the Mishnah and Shevuot that's a little more compelling, but I want to keep it simple and suggest that there might be, something to it. So that's part one, just to think about the philosophy of our words, Torah's words, how they work together or don't. Are they completely separate and our words don't come anywhere near Torah? Is it our words are supposed to buttress Torah, so when they're against Torah, it's a problem, but when they're Mekayim Torah, it's great? Or is it our words and Torah's words are separate, but they could actually Torah's words, even though they're prior, they don't cancel out our words. Our words put us in a bind and a tough situation, right? And I think this is kind of true to life when you think about the ways that we live our lives. Second thing is, I just wanted to point out the many ways that the different Gemarot explain where we get this idea of Moshe Omed Meher Sinai from the idea that we would not be able to take a shvua on something related to a mitzvah. We already mentioned the point about lav kehain and hain kelav, that it has to be something where you can say yes or no about it, meaning I'll eat or I won't eat. It can't be like a mitzvah where I'm not allowed to say I'm going to transgress this. I'm only allowed to say I'm going to uphold it. But there are a few more explanations that are offered. One is in the Gemara in Shevuot, Kav Zayin Amud Aleph to Kav Zayin Amud Bet, using the terminology of lahara ulehitiv, to do bad and to do good, and using that terminology to suggest that that terminology, which we saw in Vayikra, is terminology that suggests reshut, that suggests that we are in a volitional situation, right? And the Gemara goes back and forth about it, but that's one read. Another read is actually the fact that it says lahara O lehetiv, right? The O in the middle. And then you also see there's a Gemara in Nidarim that has a different read. It goes to Bamidbar Lamed instead. And instead of learning from Lara lehetiv, Lav Kehain, the word O, it actually learns from Bamidbar Lamed, where it says Lo Yachel Divaro. What about Lo Yachel Divaro? A person's word should not be broken. Aval Mechel Hu Lechefze Shamayim, right? It's a person, their own word, meaning about things that are volitional, they shouldn't break their oath. But about Chefze Shamayim, about things related to God, they should break their oath, right? Or their oath is chulin, their oath doesn't actually exist. Now, interestingly enough, the Gemara in Nadarim says, oh, well, maybe that applies to Nadarim also, because Nadarim are also spoken about there. But I'm gonna leave that, I'm gonna leave that you know, where it is. But we have, suffice it to say, two basic phrases where this might come from, either lahara or lehitiv, or from lo yachel divaro, meaning divaro, a person's own issues, their volitional issues. They shouldn't break their shvua, and their shvua shouldn't become chulin, but chefte shamayim, they could, right? So I think those are two very interesting different ways to learn it, because lahara lehitiv indicates sort of the expansiveness of what a person is allowed to say and allowed to talk about, and sounds very autonomous. And lo yachal devaro, the devaro is a kind of narrowing of the scope, right? These sort of go in different directions. Larao leitiv sounds like, oh, this is expansive. Oh, so we must only be talking about reshut. And lo yachal devaro is, it's devaro only, and it's not divrei shamayim. So even though the upshot is the same, the sort of directionality in terms of how we're learning it is a little bit different. Okay, so that's part two, just thinking about that. Part three, as you can tell, this is like it's a very sprawling sugya, Moshe Omed Me'ar Sinai, because it isn't just about Shevuot. When you go to the Gemara in Nidarim, there's a Mishnah in Nidarim that actually says, well, let me tell you the difference between Nidarim and Shevuot, or at least one of the differences. Zeh chomer b'shvuot mi b'nedarim. V'chomer b'nedarim mi b'shvuot. Shvuot have certain things that are more machmir about them, that are more severe about them. And nedarim have certain things that are more severe about them. Ketzad. Let's talk about the severities of nedarim. Amar konam sukkah she'ani oseh. Right? Somebody basically says, it's usher for me to build a sukkah, but they don't say it like that. They say, the sukkah that I build, or if I build a sukkah, I have to give a korban, right? Lulav shani notel. The lulav is usher to me, or if I touch it, or if I pick it up, I have to give a korban. Tefillin shani maniach, right? Tefillin, if I put them on, I have to give a korban, or meaning they're usher to me, right? Binidarim asur, if it's a neder, meaning I make it on the thing, that actually does become asur to me. Now, of course, I'm going to have to break my neder and get punished and make sure I do those mitzvot. But I really do get punished for breaking a neder. But b'shvua mutar. But if it was a shvua, it wouldn't be an issue. She'ein nishbe'in la'avor mitzvot, because a person cannot take a shvua to violate mitzvot. Now, this, I think, is absolutely magnificent. It's absolutely magnificent. Why? Because what's the difference between a neder and a shvua? The difference between a neder and a shvua is a shvua, you're talking about yourself, and God already has a hold on you from Har Sinai. The tzibor already has a hold on you from Har Sinai. You're not born tabula rasa. You're not born with a clean slate in this world. You are born into something. But when it comes to objects around you, a sukkah, a lulav, tefillin, those things, I actually can say things about them. They weren't at Har Sinai. This lulav was not at Har Sinai. It's me taking it that kind of, in some ways, makes it about Har Sinai, right? It's not it by itself, even though it's a chefza shel mitzvah. So I think this is another like additional significant aspect of saying God has a hold on us, but not on the stuff. Now, the truth is, I included a sifrei here that some people think might be saying that you can't make nidarim on this stuff either, which of course philosophically would make sense as well. Philosophically would say, come on, you can't make a neder to violate the Torah. Same way you can't make a shevua to violate the Torah. Who cares if it's on you or if it's on the object? But suffice it to say, there's a lot there. The last thing that I want to add here, right? Remember, what we've done is, number one, noted that there is a machloket tanaim, it seems, about whether you can take a shvua, either la'avor avera or l'kayim mitzvah. Three different approaches. One approach of no, you cannot, because you and the Torah are set. What you say as binding and the Torah says as binding, separate, and the Torah is prior. Another, you can say only l'kayim. Why? Because what you say should be buttressing the Torah rather than trying to violate the Torah. Three, maybe, perhaps, perchance, there's a shita out there that you can take a shvua to violate the Torah. Not that you should, but that if you take a shvua to violate the Torah, and not just l'kayim the Torah, but to violate the Torah even, that is binding on you. And now you're stuck because you're going to have to violate that shvua and get punished for it. And what happens is, yes, it's true. What we make binding on ourselves and what the Torah says are separate, but they actually can really come into conflict in significant ways. The second thing we did is we looked at the basic two categories that are used to learn Mושבע ועומד מהר Sinai is null and void. One, lahara ulehitiv, which has sort of an expansive sense of this has to be on a shvua, on something where you can do a lot, say yes, say no, do to others, right? And that's stuff that applies to reshut. Another is lo yachel devaro. Devaro, it's a person's word about their own things that shouldn't become chulin, that shouldn't become broken. But if it's about cheftzei shamayim, then it could and should. Three, which is a more narrowing. The third thing we did here is we said, well, what about nidarim? Is it the same? And it seems like the Mishnah in nidarim is very clear. Nidarim are different because it's about the chefza shel mitzvah, because it's about the object, and it's not about the person. You are, if you take a shvua, it actually has teeth. Again, you're going to have to, if you take a neder, excuse me, it actually has teeth. Again, you're going to have to violate it, but such is life. You've created that conflict yourself, but maybe from the Sifra in Bamidbar, there's a suggestion that maybe a neder you can't do either, which of course the consequences would be the same as Moshe V'Yomed Me'ar Sinai, even if one is about an object and one is about yourself. The last thing I want to do is something really fun and interesting, is that there's another pasuk that gets into this whole conversation. Again, I'm telling you, there's a sprawling sugya. You can find it in Shevuot in the Kafs. You can find it in Nidarim Tet Zayin. You can also find it in Nidarim Zayin Amud Bet and Chet Amud Aleph. And it's working off of a pasuk Tehillim Kuf Yud Tet, pasuk Kuf Vav. Nishbati va'akayema, I swore and I will uphold lishmor mishpatechu tzidkecha. I always get this pasuk wrong. To keep your mishpatim, right? Your just mishpatim. Whoa. I thought you can't take a shvua lekayem mitzvot, right? So in the Gemara in Nedarim, Zayin Amud Bet Chet Amud Aleph, we have the following. Va'amar Rav Gidel Amar Rav. Rav Gidel says in the name of Rav, Minayin shenishba'in l'kayem et mitzvah. How do you know that you can take a shvua in order to be mekayim the mitzvah? To be mekayim a mitzvah sounds like Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera's Shita from our Mishnah in Shevuot. Shneimar, it says, Nishpati v'kayem l'shmor mishpatei tikecho. We have a pasuk that says, I swore and I'm going to uphold, keep your mitzvot. And the Gemara says, what do you mean? V'halo mushba v'omen mer Sinai. You already have a Shvuah on you from Har Sinai. Elana kamash malan. No, what he's trying to tell us is, Tishari leila inish lizaruze nafshe, right? A person is permitted to motivate themselves to fulfill mitzvot by taking a shvua, not that that shvua is actually ultimately valid, right? So it seems like it's possible, certainly the way that we explain it in the Gemara is that Rav Gidel Amarav does not agree with Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, but he's only talking about Lizei Ruzema and nafshe to, get yourself psyched up to do mitzvot. But it's also possible that originally Rav Gidel Amarav held like Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, saying, no, you can take a shvua l'kayem mitzvot, right? So hopefully we got a lot out of this in terms of thinking about who we are, who the Torah is, what objects in the world are in this whole sort of cosmology of Torah and mitzvot and a life thereof. And I know it's supposed to be evergreen, but whoever's listening to this, I hope you have a beautiful Matan Torah on Shevuot. And Shevuot, see, I call Shavuot Shevuot now because of Masachet Shevuot. I hope you have a wonderful Shavuot, full of revelation and Matan Torah and Ahavat Torah and Simcha Shel Mitzvah. Chag Sameach.